innovation has the potential to affect inequality. And there are, I think, very legitimate concerns that AI, robotization, going forward will lead to lower wages of particularly unskilled workers, perhaps workers as a whole, and if markets don't work well, increase unemployment among those groups. So that's a very important and broad channel. But the second is that innovation can give rise to rents, including increasing monopoly power generated by innovation. And those rents disproportionately go to those at the top of the distribution. Now, both of the forces that I've just described are being played out, but I want to emphasize that neither of those are inevitable. That on the one hand, we could take a more active role in steering innovation. I've written a recent paper with my colleague Anton Kornek at University of Virginia, where we describe various ways in which policy can help steer innovation in one direction or another. Unfortunately, policy in the United States and other advanced countries has been steering innovation in the wrong direction. An example of that is very low interest rates, near zero interest rates, means that the benefit of saving on capital is low relative to the benefits in saving labor. And that induces labor-saving innovation, reducing the demand for labor. Similarly, taxes imposed on labor have the effect of increasing the cost of labor and again, inducing labor-saving innovation. So through a variety of mechanisms, policy has actually been exacerbating the impact of innovation on inequality. And we've been arguing that one could steer it in a different direction. In a broader sense, the most important area for innovation that we need right now is saving the planet, not saving labor. And it's always seemed curious, and it's actually evidence of a proposition that we proved that markets in general are not efficient in the direction of innovation, that right now we are saving labor when we have unemployment and problems of inequality, when we really should be directing innovation to reducing carbon emissions and energy. So that's one example where we could have, policy could have gone in a way opposite of the way it has. But the second important area of policy is obviously competition policy. The increase of the market power of the FANGs, Facebook, Amazon, Google, and the other internet giants, they've engaged in using their market power to increase their wealth, and that has redounded to their benefit at the expense of everybody else. And this is related to another issue that's being discussed actually today by the G7, and that is tax policy. That these internet giants are not only creative in innovation and creative in creating market power, but they are also creative in avoiding taxes. And they've done a spectacular job of doing that, which means that the after-tax profits, which they can distribute to their wealthy shareholders has an effect of increasing inequality and depriving the state of revenues that it needs for the pursuit of the general well-being, including policies that might mitigate the degree of inequality. So that's a broad general answer to the role of innovation in creating more inequality. But the policy that probably as important as any other is intellectual property law. And as all of you know, that intellectual property law is a social construction, and it is supposed to be designed to increase the well-being of society, which means both to promote innovation, but also promote other societal goals, including social inclusion. Unfortunately, I'm going to argue that the particular design of intellectual property regimes that we have in the United States and other countries actually exacerbates inequality and often does not promote innovation. So I'm going to break this discussion into three broad topics. Obviously, the first is related to the rent-seeking perspective that I've just advanced. The design of intellectual property is critical in the creation of monopoly power. In fact, it gives a monopoly right over the use of certain innovations, but how the intellectual property regime is defined affects both the extent of the monopoly power and the potential abuses of that monopoly power. So just because you have property right doesn't mean that you can do anything with that property right. Property rights are always constrained. Many countries have patent laws where there's a reservation for public use. And that brings me to the second aspect of it, which is best illustrated by a debate that is going on now over the waiver of intellectual property rights on those rights related to COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, tests, and so forth. As most of you know, there's a very big debate going on over that issue at the WTO. I've been a very strong proponent of that waiver. We've, I think, succeeded in persuading President Biden to support that waiver. I participated in a letter signed by more than 80 Nobel Prize winners and more than 80 former global leaders, including Gordon Brown in the UK, pleading for support for the waiver. And let me try to explain why I think that's so important and how it's related to the discussion today, because it really does highlight from a global point of view the role of intellectual property rights and inequality. Well, it is very clear that right now there is a shortage of vaccines, and access to vaccines is tantamount to access to the right to life. It's clear that those who are not vaccinated are at greater risk. And that shortage gives those who have the patents the right to decide who gets those vaccines and who doesn't. And the answer to that right now is those in the rich countries are overwhelmingly getting the vaccines, even the vaccines that are being produced in the emerging markets and developing countries. And those who, others are put at the bottom of the list. It's actually even worse than that, because there is a concern that countries that speak out in favor of the waiver, who threaten to use a compulsory license, may be put at the bottom of the list. So when you have the amount of power that the vaccine, that patent has, you have that power of life and death that gives you an enormous amount of economic power. The principle that intellectual property rights are always circumscribed was recognized by the WTO itself when it was established and the TRIPS agreement was adopted. In that TRIPS agreement, there were notions that were called flexibilities, but were compulsory licenses. And that principle of the ability to issue a compulsory license, as I said, was recognized in the WTO. Even the United States threatened to use compulsory licenses, and in the aftermath of September 11th, when we were confronted with the threat of an anthrax, and the German manufacturer of the key drug against it, Cipro, was unable to produce the relative quantities that were needed to combat it. So this idea of compulsory licenses, that is to say, a circumscription on intellectual property, is well recognized by most countries around the world. Of course, you pay a fee. It's a reasonable fee, not a monopoly price, but you pay a fee. That issue was relitigated then in the midst of the HIV Aids epidemic, where it had turned out that the drug companies had figured out ways of undermining the effectiveness of compulsory licenses. In particular, there was a restrictions on the issuance, countries getting a compulsory license, exporting the drugs they produced. And that meant while South Africa could produce HIV AIDS medicines for its own population, it couldn't export them to other African countries who didn't have the capacity to produce. And that meant thousands, perhaps millions, would have died from HIV AIDS. And again, the world came together and agreed on that principle. Since then, the drug companies have gotten expert again in restricting access to the use of compulsory licenses, a whole set of tricks, which I can't fully describe here. Now, in response to discussion of the waiver at the WTO, the drug companies make a set of inconsistent claims. They say on the one hand, the developing countries, emerging markets, don't have the ability to make use of the intellectual property. And that's the problem. Well, if they really believe that, then why oppose the waiver? Because in fact, once they get rid of the waiver, it won't have any consequence. Nobody will actually be able to adopt it. But of course, that just illustrates the two-faced nature of what the drug companies position. And in fact, the market doesn't believe the drug companies themselves. The market has, when President Biden supported the waiver, the prices of the drug company shares went down. And there's further evidence that the drug companies are are wrong. Moderna's chief chemist actually said that it would be easy for any company within a few months to be able to produce even advanced vaccines. And over 60 companies have been identified that could produce the various drugs covered by and products covered by the vaccine waiver. The reason this is so important and related to the topic at hand is that it's not only inequality in income, but inequalities in access to right to life that we're talking about. And so nothing could be more important than this issue that we're talking about today, this inequality. But we're not going to have a strong global recovery until the pandemic is under control. And if the pandemic is not under control in emerging markets and developing countries, these countries' economic prospects will be dim. So this is a case where the intellectual property is going to have immediate effect on exacerbating inequalities. A lot of discussion in advanced countries of a K-shaped domestic recovery, but we're also talking about a K-shaped global recovery. So what is really at issue here is that the drug companies want to do whatever maneuvering they can to delay access to intellectual property rights, because the longer the delay, the longer the monopoly profits. And that then gives rise to the other side of the inequality story that I told a minute ago, the increase in profits that go to the drug companies. More broadly, intellectual property, and this is a barrier to entry. And the examples I've just given in the drug company show how it is leveraged. The companies have become masters of creating barriers to entry, undermining the bargaining powers of other market participants, and leading to greater inequalities. This is a broad point that I want to emphasize, that the standard model of the determinants of the distribution of income has changed in the last 10 or 15 years. The basic model that was used, probably taught to most of you in your basic economics course, was demand and supply, a model based on competitive markets. But the broad consensus today is that that model does not provide a good description of inequalities, the distribution of income in a modern advanced economy. It's a result of bargaining power, and that in turn is a result of provisions of the rules of the game. And those provisions of the rule of the game have to do with what I've already talked about: competition policy, labor market policy, corporate governance, and most importantly here in this context, intellectual property. There's one more dimension of inequality that I want to emphasize, and that is that equalities of opportunity. Economists have emphasized that the multiple dimensions of equality. One of them is equality in outcomes, incomes, wealth, and another is equalities of opportunity. And creating barriers to entry reduces opportunities, particularly for smaller players. So intellectual property by reinforcing certain barriers to entry, reduces equality of opportunity and an important dimension of inequality. There's another broader issue that I want to raise just very briefly, and that is the broader issue of inequalities in access to justice, to rule of law, to a variety of kinds of protection provided by the legal system, and the implications that that has for inequality in all its dimensions. The way the laws are written and the rules of the game are enforced can give an advantage to some groups relative to others. Some economic historians have argued, I think very persuasively, that in some of the earlier days of intellectual property, there were large charges imposed for granting a patent. And what that meant is that access to the protections provided by intellectual property were reserved for those who were already relatively wealthy. And that it was a system that contributed to the perpetuation of inequalities. What I want to emphasize is that there are a whole array of details of the intellectual property regime that can have important impacts on inequality, and that it's not just intellectual property written large, but the details, the fine print, like in so many other areas that turn out to be very important. And let me just mention a couple of these. Some of these are related particularly towards development, in which I've been engaged on the debate about the design of intellectual property for developing countries. One of the big issues is the terms of granting patents for traditional medicines. Many of you may know the famous cases where the US granted a patent for basmati rice, or for the medicinal uses for turmeric, or for the particular uses of neem oil, or some of the controversial patents of the traditional medicines in the Amazon. Well, the way the patent law is designed allowed Western companies to get those patents and actually to sustain the patents, even in the United States when they were challenged, but not to be sustained in Europe. And that shows you that there are different intellectual property regimes, and some of them exacerbate inequalities more than others do. Another example is an issue that is very much under discussion in the UK, biodiversity, with the Stern report, with the Dasgupta report just recently coming out on biodiversity. Well, the United States has refused to sign the biodiversity agreement, partly because the drug companies don't want to pay for the intellectual property rights associated with medicines derived from genetic material related to the preservation of biodiversity. So that's an example where different intellectual property regimes would have global impacts on the distribution of income between developed and developing countries. There are another set of provisions, details of the IPR regime that favor corporate interests versus ordinary individuals, that make it easier for corporates to get a patent and sustain a patent. And then there are a whole set of issues that relate to some of the agriculture patents and the treatment of the seeds grown out of agriculture, out of patent seeds when they spread across fields. So the broader point I want to raise is that we have to think, I think, more carefully about intellectual property rights, like we have to think more carefully about many other aspects of our legal structure and our economic structures, like how we conduct monetary policy. Once we begin to think seriously about the effects of these legal frameworks on inequality, and as we recognize that our society has moved to a level of inequality that I think is socially unacceptable, has political consequences, and actually undermines economic productivity. This issue of the design of the intellectual property regime that takes a greater account of the impacts of intellectual property on inequality, that issue seems to me ought to be given greater weight than it's been given in the past. And that's why I was very, I welcome this opportunity to have this discussion with your conference. And I thought the idea of your conference was an absolutely great idea.
Great, thank you. Really a great talk, and thanks for reminding us about the broad aspects of intellectual property protection and the many dimensions of inequality, which go far beyond household incomes and household wealth distribution, but into many, many kinds of social policies. So I do have two questions that have come up on the chat. I want to make sure we get a chance to address them if you can. One is from Shmuel, my apologies for the pronunciation, Yerushalmi, who asks essentially, how can governments, in your opinion, Joe, how can governments raise innovation and I think technology adoption in ways that reduce inequality and reduce social disparities? That may not be a question about intellectual property so much as a government innovation or tax policy or something, but I'll leave that for you to think about.
Yeah, well, exactly. It's more a provision, I mean, a discussion about steering innovation. And it goes back to what I said before. If you think of our innovation system, it begins with basic research. What kind of basic research do we support? Are we supporting basic research that is leading to increasing the productivity of workers or replacing workers? Or is it basic research that is leading to saving the planet or saving labor? So that's one very basic aspect. The second one that I emphasized was that broadly, economic policy does steer innovation. If you have a zero interest rate, you say the cost of capital is not very high, and that encourages individual innovators to focus on saving labor, which is relatively more expensive, especially for large corporations who have access to cheap capital. And similarly, the imposition of taxes on labor raises the cost of labor and again encourages the saving of labor. So we have to think more about the tax structure. But there are many other examples in the other dimensions of IPR in our discussions that we've had in the context of development, the role of IPR in agriculture on seeds, I think Keith can talk about that more, has obviously had a big impact on inequality in that particular sector.
Thanks. And then just a couple of others. Let me quickly say that there's a series of questions about the waiver for vaccines, intellectual property. I suspect that yesterday that was a subject of considerable conversation and should be again today, but the question essentially arises here. All right, suppose the waiver happens and these companies no longer can execute their patents, but they still need somehow to transfer their know-how. How would you try to come up with facilitating mechanisms for them to do that? Force it, try to subsidize it? I'm not sure exactly what might work to get beyond that sort of manufacturing know-how impasse.
Yeah, that's a good question, and it's something that's bothered me. I don't think there's any easy answer. I think you have to do everything. I mean, let me say, my general view here is time is of the essence. There's a real urgency, because we know that as long as the COVID-19 flourishes, it will mutate. And as it mutates, it can, a variant that is more contagious, more deadly, or more vaccine resistant could arise. So we all have an interest in getting this disease down as quickly as possible. So it's in our common interest. And that means it's not a question of doing this or that. My view is you have to do this and everything else. So my answer is you pay the drug companies. There are some drug companies that are willing to do that. You threaten the drug companies. You say that, look at, if you don't do the transfer of technology, we have ways of making your life more difficult than it otherwise would be. We are supporting the companies that do the transfer technology in a variety of ways, not only through subsidies, we'll give them bigger orders domestically. You know, so you use a combination of carrots and sticks. And, you know, I think there are some companies, let me emphasize, there are some companies that I think are more willing to do the transfer of technology than others. And so rather than having this kind of race to the bottom, let's have a race to the top. And secondly, some of the medicines, vaccines, are not as complicated as others. And so one of the things that is, if we allow the transfer technology, there will be some that will spread very quickly. And it's the global supply that I'm worrying about. Now, of course, the companies that have the more complicated technologies are not just concerned about their own technology. They're concerned about the more simple technologies. Why? Because they don't want an increase in the global supply of vaccines of any kind. Because the more the increase in the supply of vaccines of any kind, the price is going to go down. So we know that there are companies in India and South Africa that have the capacity to make at least some of the vaccines. And they're already among the major producers of some of the vaccines. So if we lift the intellectual property, there will be, I believe, and others have confirmed this, a large increase in the supply, and that will put pressure on even the more advanced companies to transfer technology, because remember, under the waiver, you still get royalties. You still get compensated. You just don't get compensated at the monopoly price. So wouldn't you rather have some revenues than no revenues? So I think that it changes. This goes back to the general point I was making about the legal framework is about the definition of bargaining power. And the waiver changes the bargaining power of the drug companies as a whole, including the more sophisticated ones, the more complicated ones. And I think that will change the incentives, and at least some of them will engage in that kind of transfer of technology.
Yeah, I hope that's the case. And you know, there's also a lot to be said, and I'm sure will be said this afternoon, about trying to use this time to set up a framework for future elements of a global program to deal with these kinds of pandemics. So that needs a lot of thought as well. I'm going to ask one more question from the chat, and then we need to move on to the panel. But it basically comes down to this in one sentence or so for you. If there, this is from Vanessa Behrens, if there were one thing you could change in the IP system, I think she must mean the global IP system, without the help of other frameworks like fiscal policy, to mitigate its impacts on inequality, what would you change? I don't know if you could answer a question like that, but there it is.
Yeah, I think I've hinted at a number of the ingredients from a global point of view. I don't think there's any single thing. I think that the way we treat traditional medicines, biodiversity, is very important in some countries. This issue with health is absolutely vital. You know, we talk about very many dimensions of inequality, but access to medicines is very important. And the role of intellectual property, very broadly defined, has been absolutely critical. Let me just give you an example of how important it is. We've just been talking about vaccine waivers, the waivers at the WTO. But one of the big battles on intellectual property has been in trade agreements, most recently in the TPP. And I met with all the health negotiators for TPP on the issue of the IPR provisions of TPP and how it threatens the access to generic medicines. That obviously has effects on access to medicine of the poor, especially in developing countries and countries where there's not access to, where governments don't provide healthcare prescriptions. All of the health negotiators, except one, was willing to meet with me to discuss this issue. And you can imagine that one country that was not willing to have an open discussion on the issue, and that was the United States, under President Obama. Interestingly, when Trump withdrew from TPP and the other countries went ahead with an abbreviated TPP, the one thing that they changed was dropping these IPR provisions. And that, I think, illustrates the importance of these IPR provisions in access to generic medicines and therefore inequalities in health on a global scale. So it's not doesn't speak to the inequalities of income directly, but if inequalities of health inevitably lead to large inequalities in income. And so it has a direct impact on the well-being and then indirect impact on income and wealth.
Thank you, Joe. I'm going to close this part of the panel and thank you on behalf of the organizers and all of those attending for your really brilliant comments. There will be additional opportunities through the economics panel and then in the later session to raise more questions about vaccines and about intellectual property policy generally. So So again, thank you, Joe, for joining. Really appreciate it. But we should move on to the economics panel. So let me just do the panel is, what is the causal relationship between innovation and inequality, just as we were just discussing. I've already been introduced, so let me introduce the three panelists. If there's time at the end, I'll say a few things myself, but I've consciously spilled over knowing that I could limit my own conversation here. So Karsten Fink, our first speaker, is the chief economist of the World Intellectual Property Organization. And prior to that, spent several years as an economist at the World Bank. He's really done an amazing job at WIPO, expanding its databases, making them more accessible, building a great analytical program. And they put out the excellent World Intellectual Property Indicators report and the Global Innovation Index every year. He's going to be speaking about factor income shares, geography, and superstars. Xiaolan Fu is a professor of technology and international development at Oxford University and the founding director of the Technology and Management Center in International Development. They do excellent work in those areas. Her recent and current work focuses on digital technologies and inclusive development, innovation collaboration, knowledge transfer, and green innovation. She is a member of the high-level advisory group of the UN Technology Facilitation Mechanism. She will be speaking today about trade in intangibles and the new globalization conundrum. Then Professor Kyun Lee is a professor of economics at Seoul National University and head of the Center for Comparative Economic Studies there. He's also vice chairman of the National Economic Advisory Council, which advises the president of Korea on economic policy. He works on Schumpeterian growth, innovation, economic catch-up as an editor of Research Policy, a top journal in innovation economics. Today, his topic will be, is intellectual property a facilitator or a barrier against catch-up by latecomers, implications for global inequality? And if there's time at the end, I'll say a few things myself about some interesting questions that economists have been posing about potential role between, potential interrelationships between intellectual property, innovation, and equality. So I'll be cognizant of the endpoint of our time here. Each speaker is going to have about 12 minutes, and we'll allow a few minutes for reactions by other panelists and questions from the audience. And then let's just go forward to it.
Are you bringing that dog back to Nigeria?
Could I remind
Make the dog die.
To mute your microphone?
Dog deal.
I'm not sure who's speaking, but can I remind you to mute your microphone, please? All right, so Karsten, you're first up. So why don't you go ahead, and I think you can share screen if I understand this correctly.
Yeah. Thank you, Keith. And let me, of course, at the outset, thank the organizers, Oxford University and the University of Haifa, and in particular, Daniel Ben-Olil, who has been really the driving force in putting together this really impressive program on an important topic. What I thought I'd do, of course, this question of innovation, technological progress, and income inequality is extremely complex. I hope you can see my screen here. And what I would like to do is just to pick a few trends from the economic literature and, in a sense, try to distill some insights that I believe are relevant in understanding the impact of innovation and technological progress on inequality. I labeled those as factor income shares. I think there is going to be a bit of overlap with what Professor Stiglitz said at the outset. The economics of superstars and the geography of innovation, and I think it will become clearer in the course of the presentation what these trends are all about. If I can maybe start with some trends in the global distribution of income and maybe also nuance the discussion a little bit. When we talk about equality, inequality, I think we are in principle interested in the evolution of the income distribution between countries and within countries. And what is interesting, if you look at the data, essentially, after the Industrial Revolution, there was a continuous increase in inequality between countries, but that trend essentially has reversed over the last 3 decades. That is largely a story about Asia and the large Asian economies growing faster than the high-income economies. It's not a story about, essentially the rest of the world catching up to the high-income economies. But I think it's an important story where I think also technology plays a role that shouldn't be neglected. I think what we're mostly concerned about here, of course, is the increase in within country inequality that we have seen over the last few decades, really in most countries. Interestingly, if you take the two together, and that may initially sound somewhat counterintuitive, despite the fact that we have seen growing within country inequality pretty much across the world, because of the decrease in between country inequality, we have actually seen a slight decrease in overall inequality. That said, I don't want to be the contrarian here. I think we should focus on how innovation and technological progress has affected and will affect within country inequality, not least because economies are still largely governed by nation states, and it's largely national policies that matters. Now, one important aspect that is receiving a lot of research these days is the question of the declining labor share in income. So if you, for example, look at the period of the mid-1990s to 2017, which is shown here, you've seen that the share of labor income in economic output has fallen. Across the OECD, it has fallen by about 5 percentage points. It's interesting, though, to note, and I'll come back to that at the end, that you have not seen that universally in all OECD economies. And there are certain advanced economies, notably the UK and France, that actually have seen an increasing labor share in economic output. Now, I think what is important, again, there was an important shift in the 1980s. In many high-income countries in the period after the Second World War, you actually saw an increase in the labor share, but that trend essentially started to reverse in the 1980s. And of course, it differs a bit across countries. Now, the mirror side to a declining labor share is an increasing capital share. And we've done some research a few years ago in the context of our 2017 World IP report, where together with Marcel Timmer at the University of Groningen, we essentially quantified the contribution of capital, and we divided that into tangible and intangible capital, and really found that the driving force behind the increasing share of capital is the increasing share of intangible capital, and at least that establishes a correlation, with the role, I would say, of technology and innovation. Now, as I mentioned, there's a lot of research on trying to explain the declining labor share essentially in the countries where that has taken place, notably in the United States. I would say that the debate is not settled. Maybe that's another way of saying there is not a single explanation for that. There are a number of explanations for that. I think there is credible evidence that it has to do with a decline of labor unions. I think there's also evidence that it has to do with globalization. It's maybe not surprising. The last 3 decades are the decades that sometimes are referred to as hyper-globalization, with essentially lots of vertical disintegration, outsourcing of labor-intensive manufacturing to lower-wage, middle-income economies, and that in a sense explains the lower labor income share in at least high-income countries. I think is quite intuitive. More recently, really interesting studies on the role of growing concentration and the rise of highly efficient technology leaders. Although there's different stories in the literature that explain that. There's work by Philippot and others that essentially link it to institutional failures and market entry barriers. But there's also work that, in a sense, almost says it's an outcome of intense competition, winner takes most economics, where you have highly efficient technology leaders gaining market share, and these are the ones that have a lower labor income share. Now, again, I would say the debate is not settled, although I think in a lot of these stories, obviously technology and innovation plays an important role. Second strand of the literature that I'd like to briefly talk about is the economics of superstars. And I think that's a very interesting one. And the reason I included it here because it's potentially a story that can explain the rising income equality at the top 1%, the top 0.1%. And as many of you know, essentially the rising income equality at the very top is one of the distinguishing features of the increase in inequality that we've seen over the last 2 decades. Now, there's a very interesting seminal paper by Sherwin-Rosen, early 1980s, that essentially provides the theoretical framework for that essentially can explain that small differences in creative talent can lead to dramatically different economic rewards. And interestingly, I prepared this presentation here before Francis Gurry's talk yesterday, but the 2 theoretical features that Francis Gurry pointed to are exactly the ones that I mentioned in the Rosen paper, which has to do with the imperfect substitutability of creative output and creative talent. That there are lots of talented actors out there, but only one really is the one that receives lots of popularity. And the joint consumption or the indivisibility of creative output, that in a sense creative output can be shared by many at the same time. You need essentially only to shoot one movie. You only need to record one piece of music, but it can be consumed by an almost infinite number of consumers. And I think there's a credible argument that as economies have grown, and again, I will point to globalization as another important driving force, that this has amplified these type of superstars effects. And I would also say that there's supporting evidence for that. There's just a recent, really interesting study on essentially TV entertainers that shows that the top performers capture an increasing share of overall earners. There's an interesting question then, how large a contributor is this superstar effect to overall macro income inequality? And that is where I would be more cautious. There are studies that look at, who are essentially the 1%. Not surprisingly, you would find lots of company executives, managers among them. Interestingly, you would also find that doctors, lawyers are, among the top 1% earners. I guess with apologies to the many lawyers who participate in the discussion, I don't think they would, at least fall within the definition of superstars as it was conceptualized originally by Rosen. So I think, that is only a partial explanation, but I think it's still, in a sense, a relevant one. The third strand of the literature, I wonder how I'm doing on time, relates to the geography of innovation. And that is also the one, in the book volume that Daniel and others have edited. That's the one where with Julio Raffo and Ernest Migueles we focused on. So economists have for a long time tried to explain what determines the location of economic activity across space. traditionally, that has been explained by economies of scale, transport costs, and so on. And of course, in the knowledge-driven economies of the 21st century, urban agglomeration forces have a lot to do with innovation. So companies locate in metropolitan areas because this is where they find skilled workers. Skilled workers find jobs in metropolitan areas. They value the amenities of urban life. And of course, economists have always emphasized, the spillover effects that ideas flourish with innovators working in close proximity. What we did for our 2019 World IP report, we used patent and scientific publication data to identify the major global innovation hotspots around the world, also some smaller specialized niche clusters, and essentially quantified how much do these hotspots contribute to global innovation. And what we found, of course, was that this is highly concentrated. So the top 30 innovation hotspots around the world account for about 70% of patenting and about half of scientific output in the world. Now, the question is that a problem? At one level, you could argue it's not necessarily a problem. If innovation really is a global public good, it doesn't really matter where innovation takes place. It can, in a sense, do good things wherever it's applied. But there are reasons to believe that this is also a problem, and one problem is precisely that urban agglomeration creates disparities between those successful champion regions that are really successful innovating regions and essentially the regions that are left behind. And again, if you go back to the data, it seems like there was a major shift in the 1980s, that essentially before the 1980s, there was a process of regional convergence within most high-income economies, meaning poorer regions within countries caught up with richer ones. But since then, the convergence process has slowed, and in some cases, there has been outright income divergence. The report, we use the example of Tel Aviv, which I think is quite interesting. As many of you know, Israel is probably one of the most successful innovating economies in the world. You could almost argue an exporter of innovation. It has earned the label startup nation. But of course, if you look closely, most of the innovation activities within Israel take place in Tel Aviv or the greater Tel Aviv area. And this is also where wages have grown the most, where housing prices have grown. And that has led to pronounced economic disparities within Israel. A few concluding thoughts. So I think, as I mentioned, and that applies both to this question of the declining labor share as well as to this question of regional divergence, there seems to be a trend reversal that started, it's probably hard to put a precise date to it, sometime in the 1980s. And I do believe that it is plausible that innovation and technological change are at least one explanation behind that trend. At the same time, I would make the case that this is not a mechanistic relationship. There is substantial heterogeneity between countries. And I think that does have important policy implications in a sense that, policies and institutions, I think, matter in terms of how technology is adopted, how markets function. And, while there may be a universal tilt in how technology affects markets, how that plays out in different countries, I think is not necessarily mechanistic. I think just to finish up, there is, of course, and that's almost an obvious thing to say, a strong case for directly addressing inequality through progressive taxation, social safety nets, and I would also mention regional development policies here to get at the geographical angle. I think those are difficult, but I think they're certainly part of the menu. I think the more interesting question, I think, for this community here, and this is what I think many, including Professor Stiglitz in his keynote lectures, essentially raised the question: is it possible to steer innovation towards more equal outcomes? And here I probably would make a distinction between, you know, the longer term and the short and medium term. I think as far as the long term goes, it's difficult in a sense that, you know, innovation, of course, is highly uncertain. It is in many cases, you know, unpredictable, you know, what really the long-term implications of technological change are. You know, who would have thought, say, you know, the effect that the internet had, you know, in the context of the Arab Spring, you know, these are the kinds of things that are just very difficult in a sense to predict. Having said this, I do believe that in the short to medium term, and especially as far as, you know, innovations are concerned that, you know, are beginning to be adopted, or innovations that are relatively downstream, I think there is an agenda to think about, and, you know, that very much almost in the context of a grand challenge, of how innovation adoption in particular can be steered towards more equal outcomes. Let me maybe just end with, you know, with an advertisement. This is one of the questions that we are considering in this year's World Intellectual Property Report that we plan to publish in November this year. The title of the report is going to be on the direction of innovation. And I'm not sure we'll have the answer to that, but I do hope that, you know, we will have some interesting things to say about that. So let me end here, and I look forward to the other presentations. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Carsten. I don't see any particular questions for you at this point, so we'll hold off on that and move right to the next presentation by Professor Xiaolan Fu, who's going to be talking again about trade and intangibles. I think you'll need to end your screen share there, Carsten.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you, Keith, for the kind introduction. And many thanks to the organizers for having me at this very interesting and also important panel. So I will talk today about trade in intangibles and its impact on inequality. So I will share my screen. Okay, yeah. So the title of my talk today is Trade in Intangibles and the New Globalization Conundrum. In recent decades, we have seen the emergence, the increasing importance of intangibles. Exactly as I think this talk, my presentation is actually, you know, follows very nicely with what Carsten has talked just now. The importance of intangibles in economic growth and in value creation and income distribution has been increasingly important. And at the same time, we have seen the increase of science and the technology in global production and value creation. And also because of the rise of the big data, the cloud technologies. Excuse me, can someone mute your micro? Okay, thank you. And also because of the rise of the cloud technology, big data, etc., data previously, you know, not of that high value now is a very valuable resources or asset. And all these give the rise of the importance of the intangibles. And we also see the increasing embeddedness in international trade, in the trade in knowledge and services in global trade, and especially the trade along the global value chains. For the trade that's taking place along the global value chains, the transactions of the intangibles, the knowledge, technology, managerial know-how, branding, etc., all play a very important role. So we have seen, people talking about great unbundling, people talk about factory-less manufacturing. Those factories, like Apple, which does not own any manufacturing plant, but they can control a global value chain through their control of the intangibles, the IP and the technology and the brand and the brand, which accounted for a large proportion of world trade. So that's on the one side. On the other side, in the past several decades, we also see the rise of globalization, and also in the recent 10 years, the wave of anti-globalization in some of the countries, and also the increasing inequalities within the countries, like Joe and Carsten has analyzed. What is the role? What is the impact of the trade in intangibles, which take place through the global trade in various forms? What's their impact on the inequality between countries and within countries? And what are the mechanisms or the modes for the trade in intangibles? And these are the areas that under-researched. And actually, the multinationals, following the growth of the globalization, they are organizing their manufacturing in the global factory, as Peter Buckley argues. They are organizing the manufacturing in the global factory, and they are slicing the manufacturing of a particular product into different slices, different parts, and allocate them in different countries, different locations, according to the principle of maximizing their profits. And the value created along the global value chain actually follows a smile curve that many people are familiar with. So at the two ends, the value added per capita is much higher, while in the middle, value added per head is the lowest. However, at the two ends, at the left end, this is about basic and applied research, design, and commercialization, about technology and patent. And at the right side of the smile curve, branding, marketing, and the logistics, and after-sales services, etc. This also very much IP intensive or intangibles intensive. So actually, these intangibles captured most of the value added that created in the production process. And the trade model, according to Corroder and Haskell, they put this in a simple North-South trade model that the North exports intangibles and import goods from the South, And in reality, more close to the reality than we can see, the global production are organized along the global value chain, which has been highly fragmented and allocated in different countries, while also nested by various networks, R&D or services and the knowledge provision or professional services provision, etc., nested by these networks. So the global production actually is a value chain based network model. And in this type of model, we see a lot of intangibles. Either they are basic or applied research, the design, and some commercialization technology development, or the professional services, marketing services, managerial know-how, including how to manage such complex global value chain in international production, and later the branding. All these intangibles, the trade of these intangibles are taking place along the value chain, And looking at the modes for the international trade in intangibles, how does the intangibles trade between countries? The most traditional method is licensing. One party pay royalty fee and gets the license to use the technology, or providing consultancy services which knowledge also embedded. And another very important channel is foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment carried out by the multinationals is much more than financial investment. Together with it, in a bundle, are technological and managerial knowledge, including know-how and patents. And in addition to this outsourcing, like Apple, through the control of the IPs and the intangibles, they organize the global production, and we see the intangibles trade along the value chain that's controlled by the large multinationals. And collaboration is another alliances, is another very complex way of trade in intangibles. So one party can have IP and another party may have finance or market or other know-how or other resources. They collaborate, create new know-how, and then they share the value added created. So these are the 5 modes that intangibles trade across border, trade across the border. So look, based on these 5 modes, we can see actually licensing, commercial services provision, financial services provision, foreign direct investment carried out by the multinationals, and outsourcing. All these are taking place actively cross-border. These are the data showing the flows over the years, and they are increasing over years. And one of the important example that we can see how the intangibles capture most of the value added, and who capture this. I think Carsten has already shown that intangibles capture more than labor and the physical or capital. And also, this is a case study carried out again by WIPO in the 2017 report that it really has carried out the in-depth study of the smartphone value chain. We can see that Apple captured 42% of the value added was captured by Apple based on its technology and the intangibles. And the rest are materials and processing costs, etc. Actually, the overall processing cost only around counted about 1 to 2% of the total cost. So intangibles owned by the multinationals captured most of the value added. So if we look at the international trade, we have to integrate trade in goods, in services, and in intangibles all together, and look at global trade. And if we integrate all the global trade in goods, services, and the intangibles, what we can see is that the orange, we apply this method to the trade balances of some of the top trading countries in the world. The orange color shows the adjusted trade balance. So we can see the orange color shows the global trade seems to be much more balanced than the traditional measure, So this just showing that the trade in intangibles actually accounts for a large proportion of global trade and the income value added created. And where does this value added go after this correction? Actually, they have been shifted by the multinationals to places, to locations where there's a tax haven, etc., etc. And therefore, based on this analysis, today I want to focus on this new globalization conundrum, is that IP and intangibles play a very important role in value creation and value capture. And the globalization redistributed income between countries. It created jobs in developing countries. That's why in Carsten's presentation, between country income inequality reduced. However, within the country, inequality increased because most of the value added created are captured by the multinationals because their control of the intangibles. Here, two challenges arise. One is the redistribution of the most of the value added in the home country of the multinationals. So the value added captured by the multinationals need to be redistributed through fiscal policies and when the jobs are located overseas, and those sectors, those people who lose jobs should be compensated. And this is not compensated through a trade war, but redistribution through the tax policy, domestic tax policy. And secondly, is the increasing ability of the multinationals in control the intangibles, and therefore the barriers for the developing countries to upgrade. So that's two challenges. And also, if we look at the new globalization conundrum, is that most of the countries may have three objectives: income growth, full employment, and environment protection. We can see environment protection can meet together with income growth and full employment supported by technological progress. However, objective 1 and 2 will be very difficult, cannot be met at the same time because the multinationals are slicing the production value chain and relocate the production at different locations across the world to maximize their profits. So the high value added will remain in the high income countries, and the low value added assembly activity will be located in the developing countries where labor is cheap. And this will not be able to address unless the government, the rich country government, can effectively redistribute the income through tax policy, regional policy, industrial policy, and the social policies. So this actually, Carsten and Joe all mentioned in their talk early. And now I want to add one slide inspired by Joe's talk on the vaccine. We can see actually the vaccine production is also very complicated. The Pfizer's CEO claims that there are 280 components and materials produced in 19 countries. And there are also specialized new equipments need to be produced to produce this vaccine for COVID-19. And so there are a lot of know-how and intangible asset, intangible knowledge embedded in the production of COVID vaccine. And how to accelerate the global production of vaccine. And this is one of the questions raised earlier. And my proposal is that waiver of patent is a very important first step. It really changed the negotiation and the bargaining power, but it's not enough, far not enough, sufficient to accelerate the global production of vaccine. What we need to do, the next step, given the change of the bargaining power, we need to incentivize and engage the multinational pharmaceutical companies to set up joint venture with local pharmaceutical companies in different regional hubs in different continents. The joint ventures have some local labor force and production capacity can be used more quickly, integrated into the joint venture. And also joint venture will be a very successful channel for technology transfer. This has been proved from Japan's rise. Multinationals set up joint venture in Japan, South Korea, and the East Asian dragons, and also China's experience all suggest joint ventures will be an effective tool for technology transfer to the local countries. So this will accelerate global production, vaccine production by incentivizing and engaging the multinationals transfer the intangible know-hows and also build up the local capacity, production capacity for vaccine to prepare us for future pandemic and crisis. Let me finish here. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Professor Fu. A lot to think about there for sure. There is one question, but I think we'll hold off on getting that again until the end. So let me turn directly then to Kyun Lee, who's going to be talking about, I think, international diffusion of technology in the IP system. So thank you.
Okay, thank you. As one of the co-editor of this book, I feel great to have this opportunity to launch our books and also present my chapters. Okay. So I'll be looking at role of IPR as either facilitator or barrier against catch-up by latecomers. Latecomer means that emerging countries or developing countries. Okay. So in economics, there is a big discussion on the role of IPR in the context of development. We can pick up several issues. In general, we see there are big trade-off between innovation versus diffusion. Innovation requires strong IPR, whereas diffusion requires maybe weaker IPR protection. In the context of development, early stage with lower level development, technology import, transfer matter that requires strong IPR, whereas you can start doing imitative R&D that might require weaker IPR to diffuse innovation. But if you move up the higher stages, you tend to have a local company growing. They might demand strong IPR protection, whereas still other company at low level requires low IPR to diffuse or learn from other companies. That's the second issue. Thirdly, recently there is a changing in the literature about old focus on the strengths of IPR, in other words, whether weak or strong IPR is good. Now people are talking about there are diverse IPR forms, not only patent, but also patent, trademark, design. All these could have a different role in different stage of development. Okay. Last issue is that we used to talk about the impact of IPR protection on our own nation, but how about impact of its impact on others' export to that nation? For example, if US strengthens the IPR protection, how does it affect export from China to US? Those are the new emerging issues. So I'll be discussing these issues in quick 15 or minute or so. Okay. So basically, IPR could be barriers in certain contexts. Also, there are ways to overcome the barriers. That's my concluding remarks. Okay. Now, first issue is that all the focus from on high versus low IPR protection. Now we can discuss about not only low of regular patent, but also putty patent, which is called retreat model. Okay, this is based on my published papers. In the paper, I found that patent right may not facilitate innovation by latecomers, countries and firms, but rather putty patent may facilitate or increase adaptive innovation by latecomers. Okay, so as you know, the retreat model, which is putty patent, is German invention as a latecomer to catch up with the UK. So German tried to recognize minor adaptive innovation with less duration of protection period. And those are the adopted by Japan, then also Korea, Taiwan, and mainly China and so on. And it served to increase learning and building innovation capability at early stages. Okay. So in the papers, I proved that patent right significant for, not significant for low-income countries, but significant at upper middle and high-income country only. Whereas putty patent count dummy positive and significant for lower group, but not significant for high-income group. So that means depending upon your stages, different IPR forms important, regular patent versus putty patent. Also using firm level data in Korea, I proved that early days of Korean development before 1986, the utility model leading to sales growth. But in later stages, Korean firms starting file regular patent and then link to sales growth companies. Okay? Again, step-by-step role or changing role of IPR firms. Also, I found that once you start filing tutti patent, after 5 years later, you also start filing regular patent, which is confirming learning effect from tutti patent to regular patent. Issue 2 is that if patents do not facilitate some latecomers' innovation effort, how about trademark? The answer is yes. In other words, there can be a trademark-driven path of technological development, which is different from patent-driven path. So we see 2 different group of sectors. One is patent, the other is trademark dominant sector, depending upon sector's nature of technologies. Okay. So I also did this using Korean firm level data over 40-year data. This is patent-driven sectors. You see, in these sectors, trademark very small. But early days, they're filing utility model, but later they switch to regular patent. Okay. But the other group of sectors, trademark quite dominant, whether very little regular patent. These are the food, beverage, textile, fabric, and so on. Mostly, we could reason that they are more tacit knowledge sector, tacit knowledge. So if you are tacit knowledge, you cannot file patent. So company end up filing or rely on trademark to protect their own any innovation. Okay. Also, if their level is very low in terms of technology and export ability, they tend to stay in domestic market and rely on trademark to show their any uniqueness. So these are interpretation. I proved that by some regression. In regression, the codifiableness is captured by the number of patent divided by R&D of a sector. So that means if knowledge is tacit, even if you do R&D, you cannot file patent. So that ratio tends to be low in the case of tacit knowledge sectors. Okay, so basically regression confirmed that in trademark sectors, they tend to be more tacit knowledge oriented, also less export oriented. Issue 3 is that IP protection by an incumbent country can be a barrier against catch up by not every, but some latecomers who are more rapidly rising. For example, what's the impact of US IPR on China export? Okay, this all paper by me, also published in World Economy. So it examines when importers' protection on IPR interact with export level technology, what happened? Okay, so in other words, we are looking at interaction between IPR and that exporters level technology. And how does it playing in the context of export to high IPR protected countries? So because already we know that the IPR has a role of promoting export because it's based on the market power impact or market expansion impact. That's positive side of IPR protection, encouraging export to your countries. Okay, but from the perspective of South or latecomers, IPR can be barrier for export to other countries because it limits your ability to assimilate or adapt new technology. Also, it's very costly to register patent in high IPR protected countries and managing any possible IPR dispute. So we have to see whether IPR has any negative impact on export from southern country to when they try export to northern countries. Actually, now US ITC using more case of involving IPR-based litigation rather than traditional anti-dumping or CBD cases. So people are using more IPR as a arena of dispute in international trade. Okay. For example, Samsung has all trouble in getting into US market in 1986 in terms of semiconductor. And you know, Huawei from China having big trouble with the US market. They have a dispute with Cisco in 2011. Okay? So this shows how many IPR dispute Huawei has went through, large case of. After that, they turned to away to emerging country market, avoiding US market. Okay? And HTC, one Taiwan-born cell phone company, was doing very well, but after IPR dispute with Apple, it collapsed. Okay? And I also know many Korean SMEs who are going into global market, but after IPR dispute, they have to go through legal dispute until the time their sales was flat because of the legal enforcement. Okay. So these are examples of the IPR law, but I proved this by World Trade data using this regulation. In other words, export as function of IPR of the importing countries, and LT means technological level of exporting countries interaction. So alpha, beta should be positive as mentioned by literature, but I found that gamma could be negative. That means net effect IPR can be alpha plus gamma times technology. It could be negative when LT is higher, because that means higher LT means that those countries who are catching up in technology, getting more innovative, they're having more trouble with the IPR protection in northern countries. So that means not every country, but only who are catching up rapidly will have more trouble in getting into high-income countries. Okay, that's one of the key findings in these exercises. So I learned many regressions, world to world, north to world, divided into north to north, north to south, south to north. This is my key focus. And I found that this is the cases. In other words, this IPR alpha is plus, beta is plus, interaction is minus. And mostly robust if I try many variations. Okay. So this show that, for example, when try to export to northern country by increasing your technology, it could be net impact could be minus because of gamma is minus. That means catching effort by doing more innovation fail due to IPR protection. So IPR can be one source of middle income trap, not low income trap. It's more serious when export to high IPR countries in the north. But low technology group less affected by this arrangement because they export based on license FDI. So in the low income countries with low technological level, they are less burdened by this IPR protection by northern countries. So the summary, the direct impact of technological achievement and IPR is plus, but interaction can be negative, which is more robust in the case of southern export trying to getting into northern countries. Okay. So in the sense, strong IPR north can be barrier to export by technological catch-up in emerging countries. Then if IPR is a barrier, any ways to overcome? One possible overcoming solution is leapfrogging. Leapfrog means that latecomers doing something new ahead of incumbent, thereby leap over their incumbent technologies. So this way you can overcome IPR barriers because you have no need to rely on IPR held by incumbent. You are going into different technological trajectory and ahead of incumbent. Okay, that's what Korea did. Korea went ahead of Japan, going into digital technology or digital consumer electronics. That's why Samsung caught up Sony in terms of digital TV, launching that ahead of Sony and other Japanese companies. Also happened in cell phone industries. Korean company skipped analog or GSM technology, but jumped into CDMA ahead of European companies. This way they avoid competition with the incumbent company in all technological standard.
Professor Lee, it's Keith Meskis. If you could try to finish up in about a minute.
Yes, yes. This shows the Huawei citing less and less of Ericsson pattern in their catching up stories. Same thing happened between Samsung and Sony. Samsung citing less and less Sony. That means they come getting more independent eventually. And that's one source of the technical catch-up. Okay. So my final slide is that not all IPR forms facilitate catch-up by latecomers, but you can try different IPR form at different stages. Okay. IPR may be a barrier against not every latecomer, but some latecomers who are catching up very fast. And it's not skill-based technical change that causes global inequality, but IPR institutions that interfere with the latecomers' innovation-based catching up effort in this context. And there may be ways to overcome barriers. One is that leapfrog. So in the sense, I'm talking about paradox of catch-up, which means that catch-up means you try to be similar at same levels, but you got to be different to achieve it. You know, you need to create a new path, so try leapfrogging to achieve final stage of catching up. That's spelled in my recent book, In Art of Catch-up. Okay, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you, Kuhn, and great to see you again. Could you stop your screen share?
Okay, okay.
Great. So I'm not going to put any slides on the screen for myself. I'll just summarize what I was going to say in about 2 sentences. Specifically that I don't think economists have yet a great handle on the whole issue of how innovation and intellectual property interrelate with domestic inequality within countries. We just heard a terrific presentation about how they may be influencing international inequality across countries. But these are very subtle, complex issues that require quite a lot of theory and empirical work to figure them out, particularly empirical work at the micro level. I'd like to just add in passing, it's great to see that Professor Christian Kiedeich is on the call, and he's posted some slides of his own recent work in this area. So that he and his colleagues at Namur and others, rest of Europe have been doing really interesting work on sort of general equilibrium dynamic models of how inequality both is affected by IP protection and innovation and reverse causality. There may very well be reverse issues there going on. But we need a lot more empirical work, a lot more micro-based data looking at these issues. All right, I'm going to stop there and ask some questions that have come in through the chat. And we really do have to stop talking in about 4 minutes. So let me start with one that came in the context of the presentation by Xiaolan Fu, which is about her comment that focusing on joint ventures as a means of transferring technology, very important. And so the question here from Kimana Goddard, can you elaborate on the real effects of, actually a couple of questions here for you, the real effects of intellectual property and intangibles intensive foreign direct investment on basically economic development, and whether that should affect commercial policy. And then on the issue of joint ventures, a lot of these joint ventures, the foreign partner, maybe the parent partner, if you will, does often impose some performance requirements that may limit the amount of know-how that's transferred. So how would you approach those 2 questions, if you can, in a couple of minutes?
Thank you, Keith. I will start from the second one about the performance requirement. I think in the case of the vaccine, in this particular case, this should not be a worry or problem for the big farmers, because currently the cost and the price, the market, huge market demand and the cost of producing 1 dose, there is a difference. So the investment will be positive. Secondly, this is a regulated market and industry. Normally, it's not that easy just to expand to a country in this sector. And this is a unique opportunity for these farmers to be able to have a global expansion in production and in markets. Thirdly, actually, this is a global crisis. And the companies, big companies, have a corporate social responsibility. And actually, the new theory called stakeholder value maximization theory suggests that the companies maximize the value of the stakeholders in the long run, actually will benefit the company by better image, greater PR, and many other channels. So I think in this case, this should not be a problem, and the farmers should have good incentives. And about IPs and intangibles and also economic development, the intangibles covers a wider range than IP. Some people may argue data is not an IP. Data is not a creative kind of work produced by people. However, it can also be a type of asset that you can seek protection using some IP protection methods. So intangibles have a wider kind of definition than IP. However, both of them will have significant impact on growth and the development, especially given the increasing role of science technology in growth and in addressing the global challenges and sustainable development. And these intangibles will have large great impact and implications on global development, both inclusive and sustainable development. And this also opens a wide range of new area for us to research. Like Keith said, a lot of new empirics research need to be carried out to see whether, when we look at trade, including the intangibles, a lot of theories and the findings that we got in the past, whether it still holds, or the relationship between trade and growth will be even stronger, but its impact on inequality could be bigger. So all these are empirical questions need to be researched. I think a lot of questions to be researched in this new area.
Thank you. And a series of questions that actually came in during Kyun Lee's talk. There are far too many to try to cover, but let me try to put together a composite question for you. It's a very big one, and do what you can with it. It actually comes down to social policy in this area. Your perspective your perspective of, from Korea as a one-time follower country and now very much a leader country. But I think the question can be phrased something like this. Do you think there should be national or even global requirements imposed upon firms coming from developed and industrial states to sort of transfer best practices to poor and undeveloped countries to help them gain access to know-how and technology transfer? And I think along with that, another question from sorry, pronouncing that incorrectly, I'm sure. What about public interest questions in the same context? It's one thing to get private technology transfer through FDI joint ventures, another to ask what should be, should there be some sort of international regulatory system involved? And now these are really big, deep questions, but I'll just leave them for you. I mean, do you have some sense that we need, beyond the IP system, just as it exists, additional kinds of international agreements or understandings about those kinds of technology transfer questions?
Okay, thank you. In general, I think there are many help from international community toward laycommon countries in terms of arranging diverse forms of technological transfer learning. And those are, of course, helpful in enhancing the laycommers' various capabilities. So, but taking that, but the issue is, so how about when some of those are really catching up, getting close to frontiers, upper middle income stages. So then things are somewhat different because there's more issue of competition between the rising latecomers and incumbents and so on. Then technology transfer getting more difficult or complicated. And that's why latecomers have to eventually develop their own indigenous capabilities or trying to take a different trajectory path from incumbent. Otherwise, the entry point is almost close or quite different. Joe still mentioned the entry barrier issues of IPR. So it depends upon stage of development, okay? Whether the technical transfer is easily arranged in the early stage, but later stage, as you get to the frontier, the things are changed. And that's the where more difficult, challenging issues from the rapidly catching up countries, mostly from East Asia, China and Korea in the past, nowadays China and so on. Okay.
All right, thank you. We have definitely run out of time. I think the organizers need to let everyone have a short break before the next panel. So I'm going to stop things here and ask or thank all the panelists for this really interesting and spirited discussion. And I also want to thank everyone who sent in a question, has been listening along. I see that most of you are still online, so that's great. So let's stop there. Dev, I'm going to turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Keith. I'm just going to do 3 quick things before we break. I'm going to continue with the thanks. Keith, you chaired like a maestro, and we've ended only a few minutes over time. Thank you very much for that. I'd like to thank our keynote, Joseph Stiglitz, for the call to arms. We really do need to start thinking seriously and immediately and carefully about this intersection, much more than we have before, us as a community of IP lawyers in particular. And I'd like to thank our panelists, Carsten, Xiaolan, and Kyun, for the insightfulness of your presentations, the way they complemented each other and sort of fit together really nicely. And just for being kind to the lawyers in the audience and being so clear that you took us all with you. So thank you very, very much. 2 more quick things to say. If any of the panelists would like to respond to the questions in the chat by replying to everyone, they're welcome to do so. So that's just an invitation to pick up on some of the questions and answer them. And just to say that we're running about 10 minutes late. So if we can meet back here at 6:10 UK time, which is just 10 minutes after the scheduled time, we'll reconvene for our next panel. Again, thank you very much. Let's take a quick break. You can just switch your mics and cameras off. Otherwise, leave Zoom on, and we'll meet back here in about 14 minutes.
Hi, Fred.
Hi, Thomas.
How are
Good
you
to see
doing?
you.
Good to
Oh,
see
I'm
you.
fine.
It's
Yeah,
nice
you
to see you
too.
all.
Likewise.
You're back in California, I suppose.
I
Huh?
am in California. Yeah,
Uh-huh.
yeah.
Uh-huh.
And
Very good.
it looks like you're sitting in your den.
Yeah, I'm sitting in my office. Yeah,
Yeah.
at home. Yeah. Mhm. Yeah.
So,
Yeah, it's been a while since we dealt with a topic. I've just checked. The paper was written about a year ago. So.
no, that's true. Mine too. Although I suppose in my case the situation hasn't changed very much.
Yeah.
You know, we've covered a good deal of ground in the overall seminar, and just to make you aware, we are speaking live on a recording. So
I know. Oh, and
okay.
Okay.
Yeah. So I just, you know, it's you don't want to see yourself on the
thing is, I do
news.
that because the small talk gets too. We don't get any small talk options, you know. So.
No, I understand. But as moderator, I thought I should forewarn, you know.
Of course, yeah. Now I'm aware of that. Yeah, but there's no other way to talk to you. So.
No, absolutely. So yeah. So
No,
so everything's good here.
Yeah. Very good. So we'll be brief. Huh? This is
yeah, it's just
have to be brief.
maybe 7 minutes for each of us, and
I'll stick to that. Yeah.
But hopefully we'll have some ample opportunity for discussion toward the end. So
that would be nice.
Hi, Professor Abbott.
Is this Colleen?
Yes, it is.
Well, a long time no speak. How are you?
I feel like, I don't know if, you know, well, we'll talk about it probably on the panel, but since I was in your classroom in 2001, I think it was my last year. Was that the year of the South African suit? The American suit against South Africa was in 2001, was it? Or
yeah, I think that's right. That was the South Africa trial in Pretoria and so forth. And just to show how everything is related, that was also the first year that Thomas was running his institute in Bern, and I had to cancel my appearance at his institute because I was down in Pretoria. So it all ties together.
Well, the class made a huge impression, and I teach international IP now with Stephen Chow's book. I see that I don't know if that's the same Stephen Chow, but the Chow and Lee International IP book, which is excellent. I think I saw Sapna on as well. Sapna, are you teaching international as well? I don't know if she can hear us.
Hello. Yeah, I am teaching international law now, international IP.
Which book do you use?
I'm using the Trimble book, but the Chow book is great. You know, I love both of them.
Well, Professor Abbott, who is chairing our session, was my professor, so I feel a big debt of gratitude to him for encouraging me into this work.
And likewise, as I had said to the organizers when they first mentioned that Colleen would be on our panel, she she wrote, I won't single out one person above all others in their paper, but I will say that Colleen certainly wrote one of the best papers of a seminar that I have had in my academic career, and so I am not surprised that she's gone on to do excellent things after that. So it all works out.
And big congratulations, Colleen.
Oh, thank you so much. For those who don't know, I'm taking a part-time advising role with the Department of Commerce Office of General Counsel. So it's nice to be back in doing some public service, although I'm still at Santa Clara also teaching and keeping my responsibilities. So summer is a good time to be splitting the work, but thank you. I'm here on my personal capacity.
I see that Jerry seems to be on. Let's see if Jerry, is your audio working well? No, it's not too good, Jerry. It's muted. So
what I might do is,
can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Yes, much better. Much better, Jerry. Much better.
Okay, it tends to go away, come and go. I don't know if it goes. I have another phone. I'll try to get on both. I'll try to get on both the iPhone and the iPad, because we don't have a good connection here.
That might be a safe backup, because it's sometimes sounding like a Cher song from the 1990s. Otherwise, it's a little bit of electronica. So, yeah.
Right.
Thank you.
Let me get in on my iPhone.
I might use this time to welcome everybody back and introduce the chair for our next panel. So it's a pleasure to introduce Frederick Abbott. So Fred Abbott is the Edward Ball Eminent Scholar Professor of International Law at Florida State University. And many of you will be familiar with Fred's work in international IP. We've just heard Colleen confessing to a long familiarity as a former student of Fred's, and many of us have been reading and following his work. Fred's written extensively and also consulted widely in the fields of IP, public health, trade, competition law, and sustainable development. Interestingly, Fred has also actively advised developing countries in WTO disputes. So he brings that practical awareness of the international IP system to his research and scholarly work. And a couple of weeks ago, we were on a panel advising the UK government. So I know he continues to advise at very high levels. One visible strand of Fred's work is on IP and public health. He's the co-chair of the Committee on Global Health Law of the International Law Association. And he recently served as a member of the expert advisory group to the UN Secretary General's high-level panel on access to medicines. He's published widely in the area, including public-private partnerships as a model for new drug R&D. And he's worked on pathways to generic drugs, on technology transfer. But I am going to flag one important report. Across the past 2 days, yesterday and today, many of us have been debating the question of, even if the IP opens up, do countries which receive the IP have the capacity to do anything with it? And Fred's been part of a group which has produced a report titled Opportunities, Constraints, and Critical Support for Achieving Sustainable Local Pharmaceutical Manufacturing in Africa. And it looks primarily at how you finance the establishment of infrastructure to set up pharmaceutical manufacturing. So while the panel starts, I'm going to drop a link for that report, which is freely downloadable, into the chat, because I think people would be interested in having a look at it. I'm going to hand over to Fred now to chair the panel. Could I just remind everybody to check that your mics are off, because I can hear mics on at the moment. And if you're not actively speaking, we'd be very grateful if you could make sure your mic is switched off. Thank you very much to Fred and the panel. Over to you.
Good day wherever you may be. As someone noted when we started this morning, depending on what time zone you may be in, it may be the middle of the night or it may be the relatively early morning. It's a pleasure to be with you all here, and of course my great thanks to Danielle and Dev in particular for co-organizing both the book and this workshop. And it is a great pleasure to be here with so many old friends and colleagues, as well as to welcome new colleagues. So our session now is billed as a roundtable, so hopefully with a bit more of kind of intercollegial discussion, although we'll certainly put the chat discussions on an equivalent footing. I am going to take the same approach as did Keith. I am going to briefly introduce panelists on this panel and the order in which they will speak. I will then, I'm sorry, we have some cross chatter there. So introduce the various panelists in the order in which they will be speaking. Then we'll start with two presentations that are on a similar subject matter, have some discussion about that, then move forward. And then I'm going to reserve my own remarks until the end, which play back a little bit to the opening presentations during this entire two-day workshop. And hopefully that will all work and the technology gods will stay with us. To begin with, we'll be hearing from Colleen Chen. She's a professor of law at the University of Santa Clara School of Law, where she specializes in IP patents, and where she also does a good deal of work on the criminal justice system. Colleen was from 2013 to 2015 senior advisor on intellectual property and innovation to the Chief Technology Office in the Obama administration. She's internationally known for her research on and writing on domestic and international patent law, has testified before the US Congress on many occasions on these subjects. And Colleen will be talking about the inequalities of innovation based on a paper she has posted on SSRN, and perhaps we'll be able to post a link to that. The second speaker on somewhat related topic will be Professor Olenka Guzman. She is a full professor of economics at the Metropolitan Autonomous University in Iztapalapa in Mexico City. She will be talking about IP and gender, but I also note that she's done fairly extensive work in medicines and the pharmaceutical sector and conditions of production and so forth. Following Olenka's presentation will be Thomas Cotier. Thomas Cotier is Emeritus Professor at the University of Bern and the Senior Research Fellow at the World Trade Institute. As many of you may know, Thomas founded the World Trade Institute in Bern, and where they have hosted both courses and workshops over a period of many years. Among other things, in the start of his career, he was deputy director of the Swiss Federal Intellectual Property Office, where he represented the Swiss government in the TRIPS negotiations, which was when he and I first became acquainted with each other. He was working on the negotiations and I was writing about them, and we have been friends and colleagues since. Following Thomas, you have Professor Jerome Reichman, Jerry Reichman. Jerry Reichman is now Emeritus Professor at Duke University Law School. It is fair to say that he is among the few titans in the field of intellectual property and international intellectual property. Jerry was really the father of the notion of the use of liability rules as one way of resolving problems that might constitute patents and other IP as barriers to innovation. I guess among those who need no introduction among this group, I would put Jerry first. Jerry will be talking about, as far as I know, though he does have a tendency to change his mind. So we'll find out on a paper he and I co-authored in the Journal of International Economic Law on facilitating access to cross-border supplies of patented pharmaceuticals, the case of the COVID-19 pandemic. With that, what I am going to propose is that we will first hear from Professor Colleen Chen and then from Professor Olenka Guzman. Their subjects are, as I mentioned, interrelated, and then we'll try to have an open discussion, including from the chat, on those two works. Hoping that is a satisfactory introduction. Colleen, I will turn that over to you.
Colleen, you're still on mute.
Thanks, sorry about that. I just wanted to thank I'm feeling an echo. Are other people hearing it too, or it's okay for everybody else?
No, you're good. It's fine, no echo.
So I'll ignore the echo I can hear. But anyway, thank you again for the organizers of the event, my really distinguished co-panelists, as well as the chair of the session, my professor, Fred Abbott, who, as I mentioned in the earlier remarks, was one of the reasons I entered the field in the first place. And I'm just honored to be able to present again with him. As I also mentioned, I am currently taking a part-time role with the United States government, and I'm presenting this in my personal and academic capacity. So these are remarks that are not attributable to my government affiliation and boss. So I'm going to again present on this paper that's forthcoming in the Law Journal and is available on SSRN. So if you don't get private comments today in the comment, please feel free to reach out to me later. It's still in progress. And I just want to present a couple ideas from that paper that hopefully can spur a bit of a discussion. I've been working on this paper for about 4 years. Basically, since Trump was elected, I started thinking about the divisions in our society economically and what the role of intellectual property was in contributing or in alleviating these inequalities. So this is pretty much an intersection of those two ideas. And I'll just present sort of the bottom line at the front end, which is kind of laid in the title, where the topic of inequality and the quality that we've talked about during this conference, I have not been in all the sessions, typically is to think about inequality as sort of the gap between the have and have-nots, whether that be income, wealth, or access to innovation, things like that. And I think when you're talking about intellectual property in particular, we need to think about the inequalities, not just the inequality of innovation. And I'll talk about what that means in a minute. With this duality of, or sort of complexity of not just talking about single inequality, but multiple inequalities, I think also comes the recognition that there are many mechanisms in the law that can cut in either direction in terms of exacerbating inequalities or alleviating them. And there's a concept in the paper I talk about a lot about who has invention capital in society, who has the relationships, who has the intellectual kind of background in terms of training, education resources. Again, relationships are very important to thinking about who can succeed in innovation. So I talk about that, but also again, the ways that intellectual property can alleviate existing inequalities. And then the last section of the paper, which I won't get to because I have very limited time, is really about how we can promote equity and maximization, growth of innovation through intellectual property policy. And again, I'm happy to go over those in the Q&A, but I won't have time to do this right now. So what do I mean by inequalities? Well, I think, again, when we think about inequality in general, we think about economic inequality, the difference in income and wealth between those at the top and the bottom of society, whether it be households or individuals. We can also talk about corporate inequality. But again, I think it's important when we're talking about innovation to talk about also two other types of inequality. And typically we don't talk about economic inequality when we talk about IP. We're really talking about access to innovation. But in addition to access to innovation, I think we also need to talk about and explicitly think about equal opportunity to innovate and to participate in innovation and making sure that those playing fields are level. So when I think about economic inequality, I think the most interesting thing, and if you only take away one thing from the presentation, it might be this idea. You may disagree with it, but what I have seen in terms of looking at the literature and thinking about it a lot is that we typically think of inequality as a bad thing, something we want to control for, but there are mechanisms by which inequality can drive innovation. Inequality might actually be necessary for innovation. And I sort of talk about Rawls, and I talk about Hayek and others who've talked about the mechanisms by which inequality can actually be very pro-innovation. At a very base level, if we say incentives are important for innovation, and we know that incentives may not be distributed or be ultimately claimed equally, then the existence of an incentive will cause inequalities in that outcome. Another kind of simplistic idea here is that people who are the top, who have excess rents and wealth, have a lot of desire for novelties and for new innovation all the time. They're going to spend billions of their own money on pursuing their own interests, and those findings can spill over to other innovation and can really be very pro-innovation. I'm not going to go into every idea that's in the paper, but they're kind of, I would say, different ideas. This is my first real paper in this area. So at least for me, these are new to me, at least, ideas around thinking about the role of inequality and how it intersects with innovation. I will talk about this skills unbiased and biased technologically, unbiased and biased innovation a bit later. Equality of opportunity, I think we understand that concept quite well. And so I won't belabor that too much, but I think there's a consensus that we want to ensure that all that want to participate in innovation should have that ability. And that starts way earlier than the patent system, but it's important to keep in mind because the patent system also has a lot to reckon with respect to who they've left the doors open to. Finally, I think maybe most relevant for our follow-up conversation is this question of equality of access. And I think I just want to focus on the dimensions of what that really means, and that it's more nuanced than saying, everyone should have equal access to medicines. And I'm sure there's been many conversations, I haven't tuned all of them. So, obviously the distinction between essential and non-essential drugs is very important, or, medicines, right? And so I'm talking about innovation more generally, but we can talk about and understand how access to COVID vaccines, we might have a much greater consensus about that than access to, say, Viagra or other erectile dysfunction drugs. Although others would argue that they are also essential, they're important for a number of, things that, aspects of human flourishing. So I won't necessarily put that in that, but just say that there are distinctions that are important with respect to what you're talking about. And I think another thing that often, at least for me, was muddled before I sort of struggled with this paper again over this 4-year period, was thinking about the question of affordability and access that is price sensitive, and then availability. And that has to do more with actually making sure that the innovation is accessible in a convenient form, an appropriate form. So when I worked formally in government, we were working on pediatric age formulations, right? And so here's an area where we can all learn and know a lot about access to AIDS medicines and making sure that's equitable across the globe. But one population that was not underserved by the idea of just making sure that everyone had access to existing medicines is the pediatric market, because we have a much higher concentration of babies with AIDS in developing countries than in the rich countries. So this is a particular area where the paper that I think I worked with potentially under Professor Abbott's supervision distinguished between sort of these innovation needs that are particular to developing countries. And I think it's important to acknowledge that there are innovation gaps in that particular realm. And so we might have a different policy outcome. I'm gonna stop here because I think I'm out of time, but the rest of the paper sort of talks about these inequalities of innovation and what the tensions between them might be. And among them, how do we think about those? And then sort of goes into these mechanisms and what some steps forward might be. So I'll stop now and look forward to the discussion.
Well, thank you very much, Colleen. And I encourage you to seek out and read the paper. There's a great deal of statistical data and resources in Professor Chen's paper that obviously for reasons of time she couldn't go into right now. And I will turn it now over to Olenka Guzman, and following her presentation, then we'll open up the floor. So Olenka, please proceed. Thank you. You are still on mute in case you are not aware.
It is fine?
Yes, now, yes.
Well, I am... Oh. I want to do
Sorry to interrupt. I think Ricardo's mic is on. Could I ask Ricardo to just check his mic, please? Ricardo Leoncini.
I am sharing with you. I am sharing with you? No.
You were sharing before, you are not sharing now.
Oh.
Now it's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. Okay. Well, firstly, I am very pleased for the invitation to participate in this workshop and also to participate with a chapter in the book. Particularly, I recognize the efforts of Daniel Ben-Oliel, Francis Gurry, Ken Lee, and Peter Yu. I start to say, without women, life is pure prose, wrote Nicaraguan poet Rubén Darío. Not only have women inspired male poetic creativity, they have also contributed to the progress in the world. An evidence of female artistic and intellectual attributes has been left throughout history. In that sense, Rosalind Yalow Medicine Nobel Prize, 1977, say, the world cannot afford the loss of talents of half the people if we are here to solve the multitude of problems that concern us. We are exposing in 4 points this exposition. And given the numerous inequalities among countries, the world nations have agreed to the United Nations Millennium Development Goals, whose overarching intention is to fight poverty in its many guises. Among the goals, there is promoting gender equality and empowering women, and considering the new role of knowledge in today's society, fair inclusion of women encompass their entry into the formal education system, incorporation, and the real of science and technology and performance in labor markets. As gender differences are overcome in terms of access to, as well as generation, handling, and control of knowledge, women will be better able to realize their potentialities, not only surmounting inequities between men and women, but through collaboration. While industrialized countries have gender gap when it comes to access to education, science, and technology, it is much more pronounced in developing countries. As a result of the Millennium Goals, the need became evident for statistics with which to evaluate the problem and implement policies that could close such gaps, thereby reducing gender inequalities in the knowledge economy. Some international as well as national institutions to set to work to compile or separate by gender. Some facts about women researchers to underline from the UNESCO study findings. They are slightly less likely than men to collaborate across the academic and corporate sectors on research papers. There is relatively little variation between comparator countries and regions in the percentage of cross-sector collaboration between academia and industry. The proportion of scholarly output resulting from academic corporate collaboration is slightly lower for women than for men among researchers. They tend to have a slightly higher share on the top 10% of interdisciplinary scholarship output relative to their total scholarly output than men. Among researchers, they are generally less international mobile than men. However, the highest citation impact is associated with transitory researchers. Concerning with studying the contributions of women inventors is recent. Several studies offer a historical focus giving an account of the social impact of inventors made by women in different periods and industrialized countries. Others have made a remarkable effort to identify women inventors across countries, regions, technological fields, and sectors. Some studies center on analyzing patented inventions with female inventor participation in areas such as information technology. Still, other articles have spotlighted the problem of the great gap in female participation as inventors, as owners of patents in their commercialization. As for emerging and developing countries, studies have been done of Mexico, Brazil, as have comparative studies of several Latin American countries, showing the huge gap in female participation in the inventive activities, identifying the type of technology sectors in which women participate, and explaining the rate of female involvement in innovative activity, associating external collaboration and institutional sector. The literature of women inventors, and in particular on factors affecting women's propensity to innovate, remains limited. The relevance of the chapter we have written in the book is validated to extent that the study of nature, dynamic, and factors which explain the propensity of women to innovate in emerging countries may contribute policy proposals designed to increase women participation in inventive activities. This, in turn, will positively impact growth and development in such countries, helping to accomplish the Millennium Goals. Over the past 20 years, a growing number of patents have a woman as named inventor, resigning from 13 in 1998 to 31 in 2017. In most patents where a female inventor is listed, they are either working alone or a part of a mixed gender team. The proportion of patents application with have several female inventors has more than doubled from 2% in 1988 to 4.5% in 2017. Further, the proportion of application with as many female inventors as male grew from 3% to 8%. A small victory, but it indicates that women are playing a more important role in innovation. We can see that, how it is increasing from 1995 to 2015. The greatest levels of female inventorship are within biotechnology, pharmaceuticals, and organic chemistry. Although 65% of chemistry-related patents come from all male inventors, female inventors feature in the remaining 35%, with at least one woman inventor appearing on the related patents. Over almost a third originate from mixed teams. In contrast to most of other fields, a significant proportion of patents applications in biotechnology and pharmaceutical have mixed teams with more than one female. Within the other sector, which had the largest proportion of patents with a sole female inventor, the most important fields are furniture and games with 6% and other consumer goods with 7%. Female participation is lowest within the mechanical engineering sector. Both genders show low levels of specialization in textiles and paper, fixed construction, and mechanical engineering, lighting, heating, weapons, and blasting. This is because there is relatively low level of recent patenting in this field. The fields that show the largest gender disparity are electricity, in which 20% of males specialize, but only 70% of females, and human necessities, in which 43% of females specialize, but only 26% of males. China has seen the largest increase in female inventors over the past 20 years, from 10% in 1998 to 14% in 2017. France has had the largest proportion of female inventors in 1998 and currently sits steady around the 16%. The largest proportion of female inventors are generally in Asia and Eastern Europe countries as Romania, Latvia, and Serbia. In Western Europe, Spain, France, and Italy have higher proportion of female inventors than the United Kingdom, Germany, and Scandinavian states. Inventor teams for the 7 countries with the largest number of resident inventors. France has the largest proportion of patents application with several female inventors.
Professor Guzman, can I give you a time notice, probably begin to wrap up soon? Thanks.
How much time I have?
Well, let's call it a minute or two.
Well, the thing that I have to communicate in this workshop is that we have studied the emerging countries, Brazil and Mexico and India, and we have seen how the participation of women inventors has increased. But the important thing is that we have proposed a model to find what factors could favor the propensity of women to innovate. And we have the results of the statistical analysis we have made, and we have found the certain proposals based on the results of our modelations toward fostering diffusion of the technological knowledge codified in patent documents, increasing the number of backward patent citation. That means to increase the research and development efforts. Increase inventor team size, including more women inventors. Increase of innovation in firms and institutions. As Mexico has been specialized in mechanical sector, one recommendation is to support development and innovation in this sector, incorporating more women inventors and thus diminishing gender inequalities. Nevertheless, does not eliminate the importance that other fields have, especially those with greater knowledge intensity. It adds presence of foreign research in the inventor teams. In the case of Brazil, increasing the number of researchers on teams, encouraging women to join, stimulate individual innovation. According to Brazil's specialization, strength innovation in the drugs and medical, electrical and electronic and other sectors. And in the case of India, to improve innovation firms and therefore patents, and so incorporate more women in research and development activities, especially in drugs and medical, electrical and electronic and others. But also encouraging an increase in claims percent, which is apparently associated with seeking a broader range of claims. It requires not only the talents of men, but also of women. While India is the most backward country in terms of the various aspects of the gender index, the country has registered steps forward that make greater inventive activity possible for women and are thus reflect in the dynamism of patent growth, especially those that are more technologically intensive. The potential growth of well-being of nations in the world will have to be supported by merging of cognitive skills and innovation of women and men. Thanks.
So thank you very much. Thank you. So we have some excellent questions that came in for Professor Chen. The first came from Rahul Bajaj. Thank you, Professor Chen. Can you reflect on some solutions that you propose in your paper? Your diagnosis of the problems is very clear. I'm just wondering how you aim to address those issues that you have flagged up.
That is a question for me?
No, Colleen Chen.
Yeah,
no, for Professor Chen.
Fred, I think Colleen's having some technical difficulties. She's in the waiting room waiting to be admitted in. So if we can just maybe either move on. She's back. Colleen, we can see you. Do you have audio? Do you have audio as yet? I don't think she does. So we'll see if we can sort out that problem. So maybe we can circle back to the question at the end of the panel.
Okay. Yeah, we have a number of questions for Professor Chen. So let me see if anything came in. So she's restarting. So while we're waiting for Colleen to come on, Professor Guzman, let me just you know, in the role of moderator, ask one or two, at least one question to you. So we've seen recently, for example, if we look at Walter Isaacson's recent book on Jennifer Duda and her role in the discovery of use of CRISPR technologies, that we're starting to see more recognition of the role of women and also addressing some of the, let's call past undiscovered contributions of women or unrecognized contributions like Rosalind Franklin and X-ray crystallography of DNA structure. Do you think that maybe some of the historical statistics that you refer to are biased by simply the fact that women have not been acknowledged for the discoveries they have made up until now, and that somehow, let's call it the corporate structure of the patent system, isn't a reflection of the scientific accomplishments, but just the acknowledgements? I'll turn that over to you, Professor Guzman.
I thought that it was a question for Colleen, but it is.
Well, Colleen's back, so you can reflect on that. Let's go back to the questions. There were quite a few questions for her. Let's go back to that. So, Colleen, you've seen at least the first question in the chat box, which you referred to on the diagnosis versus the solution. So, please.
So I want to acknowledge up front that I think that the patent system is a fairly limited tool for dealing with inequality in the various forms. And I talk about the public-private law distinction and sort of the public levers that are more powerful, more direct, whether it be tax law or it be education law or, you know, regional incentives for innovation. Those are going to be, you know, the ones that I think, depending on which type of inequality you're talking about, are going to be much more targeted and directed. That said, the patent system can do a better job at supporting both public law intersections with innovation, as well as just being a better patent system. So I draw attention to a couple different ideas in the paper around, first, focus on inequality metrics as important for sort of prioritizing what do we care about in the patent system. So every year we see that there are reports on, for example, the number of patents that are issued every year, and that number goes up, and that's seen as a positive trend, which I think it very much is. However, what we don't see in those trends are things like what Professor Guzman just showed, which are what are the trends with respect to the particular groups that we want to be participating in innovation? How do we actually also see what the regional diversity, what the gender diversity, what the racial diversity, what the class diversity is in participation. And so if we could pay attention to those equality metrics or inequality metrics to a better degree, I think we would show that we're prioritizing innovation by all and in a broader way. Now, others might say, well, again, the patent system is only one type of innovator, and there's also many people who do not patent, as well as those who may follow on that are stakeholders. So, I'd be open to talking about how to measure those sorts of other types of innovation metrics. But again, because I'm focused on levers within the patent system, that's why I focused on equity metrics in patenting. And there's equity metric trends in many areas. I think those of us who've been following COVID understand that, you can't just look at national trends. You can't even look at state level trends. Those of us who live in the United States focus on what's happening in my county, because that determines whether or not I can go to school, have my kids go to school, whether I'm allowed to travel, right? So looking at trends at a much more granular level is one of the ideas in the paper. Another is strengthening the intersections between patent law and public law. So in the United States, again, we have various laws. I've just cited antitrust, tax, et cetera. And a lot of those depend on an understanding of the patent system, which is hard to discern based on the records as they are available. Now, the US has done an amazing job, I would say, in the patent office at making statistics available, but they aren't necessarily still completely comprehensible to those who are interested in public law questions, even like who owns, where has all the government money gone? Where are all the inventions that flow from government money and for which there are obligations? That sometimes takes a FOIA request. It shouldn't. It should be much more straightforward. So these are the types of things I discuss in the paper. There's also a lot around just increasing invention capital. Again, going back to the relationships, the ability to find people that can help you with your innovative idea. Once you have it, again, just if we take the patent system as not having a lot to do with the education system per se, but knowing to apply for a patent, finding a patent lawyer who looks like you, right? So the paper talks about examples where inventors can't find adequate help, and historically how that's been a factor. So I'll stop there, but those are the types of ideas that are discussed there. They're very, I would say, incremental. They're not necessarily huge ideas. I think they're also more practical and more, possibly palatable to a policy audience.
Thanks very much. Let me turn to the next question, which is basically a complex question of economics. I don't know if you see it in your chat box, but perhaps for the benefit of the audience, I'll read it. I'm not going to try to summarize it. When I understood you, this comes from Christian Kidane, the end of the name is cut off. When I understand you correctly, you said that more inequality might increase the demand for new goods and thereby stimulate innovation. I think there is a limit to this argument. Imagine that inequality is extreme and that only one person had all of the income. Then it would only be profitable to pay the fixed cost of innovation if you could sell the innovation at a very large price to this person. If there are, however, substitutes to the innovation, even intellectual property to protection does not allow to charge a very high makeup. The fixed cost of innovating can then only be recouped if sufficiently many people purchase the innovative goods. In such a case, a more equal distribution of income might increase the demand for new goods and incentives to innovate. Well, I throw that to you.
Right, absolutely. And if you kind of go back to the philosopher's statements of it, right, the second part of the difference principle of Rawls, who I think we're all sort of working within that framework, it says that some inequality is tolerable. It's not to say that more inequality is better or that every level of inequality is appropriate, but some inequality can be tolerable if it makes the worst better off, right? So if we use that as our yardstick, the question would be, so for example, I talk about in the COVID context, that some millionaires can afford these rapid tests, and could do that even a year ago, and we're being able to get them. Their ability to consume those and demand those, it might cause outrage at the very beginning when those innovations are being, put out there, they are having parties and doing these rapid tests for 20 minutes, whereas essential workers have to wait several days. But the existence of the demand by rich people for those innovations creates that information. Because innovation has spillover effects, that ultimately should lead to the rest of us getting access to rapid tests more quickly than had there never been that initial demand. So that's the kind of, I think, unexpected relationship between inequality and sort of the different existence of a rich population which can't afford novelties. Those instincts can lead to innovations that everybody can benefit from.
All right, thank you very much. Professor Guzman, now let me turn back to you. Would you like to comment either on the question I asked you as hopefully a useful filler while we waited for Colleen to return, or is there some other follow-up comment you'd like to make about what you heard Colleen present or what the questioners asked?
We have found that there are different patterns of innovation and different patterns where women inventors are incorporated. And the specialties, there are differences among the three countries in the scientific discipline and therefore the three countries are different in the expenditure of the research and development. And for example, Brazil has spent more research and development by GDP, 1%. Mexico is still low, and India has made the effort, and they have more patents. The efficiency of the activity of invention has been more efficient in Brazil, and Brazil has incorporated more women as researchers, and they have also the incorporation of women inventors.
Thank you very much for that. You may have been responding to the question that came in, but let me repeat it for you. This is from Anna. Professor Guzman, in your research about Brazil, India, and Mexico, did you find there is a trend among these three countries that held and still hold back women scientists? I am referring to the social structure of the social safety net for married women to continue their professional careers, which impacts on your study on gender in the patent data. Thank you for your presentation.
I think that there is a problem, certainly that women that got married sometimes not leave the research activities, but they take the activities slowly. And little by little, the policy must be asked to support women to have the children, but to continue in the research activities.
All right.
I think that was a really, well, I thank you so much, Professor Guzman, for your research. I missed a little bit of it, but I wanted to follow up on that question and then also ask if you were going to make your slides available because I was unable to hear all of it. But were there things that you thought specifically were policies that were present in any of those countries where the country made it possible for women to work with children? And were those specific to innovators, or were those more general in terms of participation in the workforce? Like, do women innovators have special needs that are different than women who are working in the workforce more generally during their childbearing years?
there are, like I said, that there are differences. I think the Indian women have incorporate more in activity research, but they are less paid. And in Mexico, we are fighting to have more better conditions of work. For example, in this pandemic time, there have been a woman that have been to stop the some activities because they have to care the children for the education at home. It was very, very difficult. But for example, I want to say, once I talked with PhD students in Guerrero, where is a state of Mexico, where there are many violence. And one of them, of this woman student, say, I don't know if I must continue to study and to become a researcher or to get married. And I told her, I think you must continue to be a researcher because you are the beginning of a new generation in Guerrero. We have to change the violence that is in the state with the narco violence, and to change by growing knowledge. This is very important. I think that still there are many disparities, and the policy must be access to incorporate more women in research, in scientific research.
Thank you very much both for that. I'm afraid now we're really running into some time constraints, so we'll move from those presentations. We can come back if we have additional time at the end. And I'm now going to turn to Thomas, who will be talking about the role of the notion of equity in technology transfer, development, and inequality. So Thomas, I turn it over to you.
Thank you, Fred, and thank you, Daniel and colleagues, for inviting me and including me in this very interesting seminar and conference. I would like to, as you say, address essentially the case of transfer technology in the context of climate change mitigation and adaptation. This is a particularly important issue because trade law is gradually moving to start distinguishing products and how they're treated on the basis of production and process methods, which means it is more important how a product is being made in a sustainable or non-sustainable manner than actually its own physical characteristics. So the production method is becoming central, and the production method, of course, is also very, very dear to technology. And so what is interesting, I think in the field of climate change, that we're operating under the emerging principle of the common concern of humankind, which understands climate change, mitigation, adaptation to be a globally shared problem. And if you look at transfer of technology, it's actually a win-win situation because it doesn't make any difference where a particular product is being produced. If the technology is sustainable, then it will benefit the whole of mankind. So this win-win situation is interesting also to explore the transfer technology side in the IP field. It would seem to me that our rules as they stand with licensing, with competition rules, partly price controls, they work where there is a level playing field between industrialized countries, and perhaps also the emerging world, as Peter Yu described them yesterday, which is catching up here. It certainly does not work with respect to the global south. And we all know that Article 66.2 of the TRIPS agreement does not really work. And the reason, of course, is that governments do not own the technology which should be shared, but they can only provide incentives. And most of these incentives are actually to be found outside of the IP field. I'm talking about subsidies, including tax rebates. I'm talking about corporate social responsibility, private-public partnerships, and perhaps other elements like investment protection law here. But how does it look like inside? And what can inside IP, and what can IP contribute to this as such? And the paper which I wrote for the book is actually exploring the question, to what extent can we refer to equity as a principle of law, which in international law has become very prominent in the law of the sea, depicting a topical jurisprudence of balancing different factors to find an equitable solution, mainly in maritime boundary delimitation here. When you think about equity in the present field, perhaps the doctrine of unjust enrichment comes to mind here. And I think this is an interesting angle which I'd like to put on the table. I don't think it has been used extensively in the field of IP. IP holders are entitled to exploit an IP right as long as it exists and under the scope as it exists, irrespective of the profits the person is making, or the company here. The foundation of IPR, however, is essentially to grant a monopoly right to allow inventors and other creators to recuperate the investment they made to create the information in the first place. And once the investment is recuperated, then essentially it should fall back in, the information should fall back in the public domain. We may also discuss to what extent there should be also a profit to be made, but certainly under the doctrine of unjust enrichment, this is not something which should go eternally until the right elapses. And some rights never elapse. Think about trade secrets, or think about trademarks, which can go even for centuries here. So I think to ask the fundamental question, to what extent the doctrine of unjust enrichment could help us to recalibrate intellectual property in order to get the information into the public domain so that other people can actually then use it for creative imitation, I think is an interesting approach, which I think would be worthwhile further exploring. We can do this within the framework of climate change and under the doctrine of common concern of humankind, but we may also ask the question in the broader sense, and then asking to what extent equity and the doctrine of unfair enrichment would actually contribute to recalibrate the existence of the current scope and duration of intellectual property rights, and thus contribute to less inequality. I remember Carsten Fink told me when I asked him, is there any evidence on equality in IP? That was about a year ago. He said, we don't have much empirical study on this. And of course, we may simply conclude from the protection of property as such that it contributes to inequality. That the same is also true in our own field. And I think many papers today have made the case and showed. So we showed that. So we need to be careful, and we need to think hard. And my suggestion is to examine the doctrine of unjust enrichment and what it may contribute to transfer technology in the particular field of climate change mitigation, adaptation, but also beyond that in IP law in general. Thanks.
Great, thanks so much, Thomas. I have not seen any questions come in the chat while you've been talking, but I think what I will do is move on to Jerry and let him to present, since we run up a bit against time, and then come back and address questions to both of you when we've done that. Jerry, can you begin?
Me?
Yes.
Okay.
Now, yeah, good.
All right. So I'm just going to talk about compulsory licenses as a potential antidote to inequality in access to medicine. The Declaration on TRIPS and Public Health says we must have access for all, but under the present circumstances, we know we have a 1090 problem that often the pharmaceutical companies only sell it at prices 10% of the population can afford. So to address this, we also know, can you hear me all right? There's an echo. Can you hear me?
It is okay. There's a bit of an echo, Jerry, but I'm not sure you'll be able to fix it. So I think we can hear you well enough would be my answer.
Okay, all right, I'll continue. So we know that the TRIPS agreement, besides protecting pharmaceuticals, it also gives us compulsory licenses as a matter of right. And we also know that compulsory licenses are older than the TRIPS rules. They go back 100 years. So when we think about compulsory licenses in regard to pharmaceuticals, we know we have a potential manufacturing problem. Country A can issue a compulsory license, but it may not have the capacity to produce the goods. Now, this problem was addressed and solved in 2007 when we got Article 31 bis of the TRIPS agreement. And Article 31 bis allows a country to issue a compulsory license and export the entire amount back to another country where there is a compulsory license but no capacity to produce the manufactured goods in question. So in other words, putting Article 31 and 31 bis together, we have the possibility of back-to-back.
You've cut out.
Okay, I'm back on.
You're back on, yeah.
Okay, so we have the possibility of back-to-back compulsory licenses and under the TRIPS agreement as amended. And the question is how best to implement these flexibilities, as they are called. Now, you often hear that, oh, these flexibilities are very complicated. They're not complicated. There is a coordination problem. How do you get governments to work together? But there's no complexity in actually issuing the compulsory licenses. So Fred and I have written on this in 2 articles. Our last article in 2007, in September, is published in the Journal of International Economic Law. And we have basically two important proposals. The first step is to promote pool procurement strategies. In other words, one country has a very limited demand for a certain pharmaceutical, but 2 or 3 or 4 countries can have an extensive demand for the same pharmaceutical, and this can interest other countries and the pharmaceutical industry in serving this market, can make it profitable and worthwhile. It can make it worthwhile for other countries to come in and develop generics, say India, to serve this market, because you have 3 or 4 countries together. And remember that under the rules as they now stand, countries in Africa can export from one to the other under compulsory licenses. So there could be very broad markets, pooled market procurement possibilities in Africa alone. And let me just add that when we think about pooled pharmaceutical supply strategies, one could ask, does this work? Can we do it? And we have an example of this, the Marrakesh Treaty and copyright law. You have pooled distribution of books for the blind, reading for the blind all over the world by a kind of mechanism that we are, that is regional pharmaceutical supply centers. Because what we need is an entity that knows how to use these rules, has a lot of expertise, and is able to assist countries to make use of compulsory licenses in a way that benefits everybody. And we think that the way to do this would be to establish regional pharmaceutical supply centers. So
well, that's weird.
That went away.
Jerry,
right.
if Jerry, you have on your phone, I think you also have on a second computer instrument. If maybe you turned off the second computer instrument, that's what's causing the echo.
Okay, can you turn me off? Can you hear me now? No, I don't have the second one on.
No, it's an echo. I think we just have to live with it. I think we risk cutting you off completely. Go ahead.
Okay, but I finished. Basically, if I think that this idea of regional pharmaceutical supply centers is a really good one. They would know how to use the compulsory licensing apparatus. They could advise governments. They could have ready-made modalities for doing it, and they could know where to get the drugs produced and ensure proper distribution. So I would really like to see the WHO get to work on establishing these regional pharmaceutical supply centers who would know how to use and these flexibilities. And remember, when you threaten a compulsory license, you don't have to issue it if the problems are dealt with. If the pharmaceutical company itself lowers the prices or makes the products more widely available or allows generics into the market, then you don't even need the compulsory license. But if we don't start using these compulsory licenses, we're just missing an important opportunity. And that's why I'm very skeptical of the notion to suspend the WTO and get a waiver of the WTO. What we need is for developing countries to use the flexibilities that are in the TRIPS agreement. Make them tools that people can use, that countries will use. And once we start using them, then we ought to be able to solve a whole lot of problems. And we can only deal with what problems emerge once we start trying to solve them. I will stop there. I'm sorry for the echoes, but I'm happy to take any questions.
All right. Well, perhaps I'll use my 3 minutes here just to briefly fill out some of the rest of that. And and refer you to the Journal of International Economic Law. The article Jerry and I wrote that we really started at the very outset of the pandemic had two core parts. And Jerry basically just described the second part to you, which had to do with regional procurement centers.
That's right.
The first part dealt with our recognition that we did not want to see patents and other forms of IP or regulatory exclusivities become a barrier to the wide distribution of pharmaceuticals. So we proposed the creation of a technology pool, which we went into in considerable detail, recognizing that we'd have supply shortages with respect to vaccines and that therapeutics would eventually be developed. And what distinguished our idea of the pool, the technology pool, from a number of proposals that were made and have been made, is that we thought that this would have to have a compulsory element or characteristic, that companies, and this goes back to what Francis Gurry was talking about yesterday morning, that companies were not simply going to volunteer to turn over their technology. And so we went through an analysis of why we thought that the voluntary approach was unlikely to be the successful approach. And one of the things that we thought was going to be particularly important about the mandatory feature of the pooling arrangement was that we envisaged that due compensation would be provided to the creators of the intellectual property. And so one thing we stressed then, and I would stress now, is that it was never our proposal to undermine the incentives for innovation. We envisaged and had no problem at all with the pharmaceutical industry, the vaccine manufacturers making a very substantial income from what they had innovated and what they had produced and distributed. The only difference between what we proposed and the current situation is that technology would be available to manufacturers and users everywhere. And that we could envisage an institutional arrangement which would either be global or more regional and localized. And going back to a few of the suggestions made this morning, in that suggestion, we made the proposal for regional production hubs and the funneling of this technology into regional hubs, including in Africa. And Dev, at the outset of this session, mentioned the study that I managed under the Open Society Foundation, in which we canvassed very deeply the production capacities in Africa and the financial arrangements. I think that maybe when Joseph was talking this morning, he was a bit optimistic about what the current production capacity is in Africa. BioVac, which is the only mainline potential vaccine manufacturer, is in its 18th year and is just beginning to commercialize production. Aspen, who I've talked with at some length, is able to do fill and finish work, but that is not really a major solution to vaccine capacity supply. So we envisage it is going to take some time to get production up and running in volume outside the existing system, which simply means that while the proposal for a waiver may be a significant proposal, merely waiving IP rights is I think it's been mentioned before, necessary but insufficient to tackle the current challenges. And our proposal and pooling and so forth may be looking towards more of the long-term institutional arrangements that need to be addressed not only for the current pandemic, but for building a pandemic preparedness treaty and something that can be built into addressing the technology side. Now, regrettably, that is not the subject of the paper I produced for this book, which instead has to do with managed trade protectionism and terms and conditions of trade and investment agreements. But we don't really have the time to go into that now, but we do have one or two questions, one for Thomas. Thomas, if setting, pricing, and profiting come within the scope of IP inherency doctrine, How far should we import external norms to IP, or should we resolve the problem by internal norms of IP system? And that's coming to you from Atul Karim.
I think the approach I would normally suggest is that we have to embed intellectual property in the overall legal system, particularly in the international law system, and we need to take into account all the pertinent rules which may influence the problem. Having said that, I think there is another agenda to work on these questions within IP itself. But I think both of unjust enrichment is essentially relying upon the abuse of rights doctrine in the end of the day, which is a general principle of law and which thus also comes from outside into the more technical field of IP. There was I think there was also another question on top I can read. Let me just read it. If IP becomes accessible to the public domain once investments have been internalized, how can we prevent from claiming extortionately high R&D investment costs? Now, I think this is a very interesting question, and I was just thinking the scenario of a patent violation a trial here, where somebody uses the information and then the patent owner objects, and then the defense would be that the patent owner has already recuperated most of the investment, has made a fair amount of profit on it, and now should be obliged to share the information with the public at large. And I think a judge would be in a position to seek the necessary information to obtain all the necessary data of the factors, production factors, production costs, pricing, etc., to come up with an assessment as to whether the profit has been excessive. I think we are essentially specifying here an abuse of rights doctrine here, and it would apply in cases where these profits really are very, very high, and just use is being made of a duration of the right, which in many cases even is unlimited in time if you think about trade secrets. So trade secrets should be protected, in my view, just to the extent that they operate with that limit and not internally.
Thank you, Thomas. And Daniel, you'll stop me. There's a couple more questions, at least one here I'd like to put to Jerry, and then a couple more words. But if you think we're out of time, so you let me know when we're out of time, okay?
Let's take 2 more minutes if possible.
Okay, well, Jerry, this is going to be quick then, and because there's another one after it. Under your proposal, what would be the threshold for the issuance of a compulsory license? When should it be put on the table? Should it be the default option, or should it be brought into play on voluntary negotiations breaking down? And well, I have a second question from Olenka, but let me just ask you that one, Jerry.
Well, it should always be an implicit threat of the negotiations, but you would prefer that you get a voluntary negotiation, and the more that compulsory licenses are acknowledged to be available, the more you're likely to get a voluntary deal, because both the pharmaceutical company would prefer to avoid the compulsory license. But you won't get that if you suspend the rules of the TRIPS agreement, or if you don't use compulsory licenses. What I want to see is more use of them, but once you use them, you don't need to use them very often. Fred, let me just clarify one thing. This article is not what I'm putting in the book, Daniel's book. In the book, I, with 3 other co-authors, were writing on access to genetic sequence data for pharmaceutical medical research, a very hot problem. I just thought that because the COVID crisis is so severe all over the world, I thought it was important to get this compulsory license alternative on the table in a major conference. But the genetic sequence data issue is a big one. It's very important, and stay tuned because we have some ideas about it.
Well, thank you very much, Jerry. And regrettably, I do think we're out of time, and so I'm going to turn this over to Daniel and let him proceed. Thank you, Daniel.
Thank you very much, Fred. I'd like to join you and my colleagues Dev Gangji and Robert Burrell, heading the Oxford IP Research Center, in thanking you wholeheartedly for a wonderful session. I want to thank our two keynote speakers, our chairs, our participants, and mostly our research students attending from around the world. Are many fantastic speakers, that's needless to say. Before I call it a day, I'd like to leave you with one last thought, if I may. If you think of the rising inequality rates we discussed, it is remarkable, I think, to realize how little unmitigated policy has been advanced to date, not to mention the limited theoretical and empirical research. Thinking, for example, of Thomas Piketty's monumental Capital in the 21st Century, or his other volume, The Economics of Inequality, it is remarkable how innovation activity, including R&D propensity and patenting activity, has largely been overlooked. At the same time, his books have been published. It is also a fact that the OECD, the World Bank, and ultimately WIPO have barely started to seriously consider the topic of innovation and inequality and the specific role of IP. So the good news is that the awareness is possibly on the rise, and thank you everyone for generating and sharing this growing awareness. I remind you that you're all warmly invited to read our forthcoming book freely online and listen to the conference recordings, which we would be sharing with you very soon. All the best and goodbye, everyone.
Thank you, Daniel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Congratulations.
Likewise. And thanks to all of our panelists for that final session.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Bye,
Fred.
Bye-bye, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Jeremy.
Bye.